All right, thanks for joining us, everyone, to the Wednesday Quaternary Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Pleasure. He's at Sheffield University, and he's speaking to us about this really interesting paleo ice sheet model simulation he's doing in Greenland. So I'll turn it over.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Megan. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. I'm Tancrède. I'm a postdoctorate researcher at the University of Sheffield. I was until this week, and now it's just started a new postdoc in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And so today I'll be talking about the work that I've been conducting as part of my postdoc at Sheffield for the past couple of years, looking at reconstructing the Greenland ice sheet at the scale of the entire ice sheet from both data empirical reconstructions, but also from some modeling work that I've been conducting. So you can see a list of people here that I've been working with. Most of them are in Sheffield, so I want to thank them and also thank the founders from the ERC on this work. So, yeah, okay. So the first slide will be a bit wordy, sorry, and then after that it will be less less wordy, but this is mostly to talk about motivations for this work. So the first motivation for this work is that the future of the Greenland ice sheet is still uncertain. So we could have up to 7 degrees of warming by the end of the 21st century. And even for one emission scenario, the contribution to sea level rise from the Greenland ice sheet remains quite uncertain and vary quite a lot between models. And one of the sources of uncertainty, there's quite a lot, but one of these sources of uncertainty between models is the model initialization procedure, which differs from one protocol to the next. And most of the time only takes into account the sort of historical data we have to inverse our ice sheet models for the present day ice sheet. And this historical data has a short time span, so we are limited by this. And if we take only this into account, we omit the committed mass loss and the long-term ice sheet memory. So the present day Greenland ice sheet is influenced by changes that have occurred over millennial timescales, quaternary timescales. And it's important to take into account this memory. So this is one motivation to produce some empirical quaternary reconstructions, which are useful to calibrate our models over longer millennial timescales. Another motivation is that we have quite a lot of unresolved questions today about the last glacial maximum, but also the deglacial evolution of the ice sheet. So there's a whole list of open questions here. I've just shown three of them here, just that popped up in my head. So for example, how far and when did the ice sheet advance during the local LGM? And how quickly did it retreat during the deglaciation? How heterogeneous was the deglacial response in different regions? Also, how did the ice sheet mass loss rates during the deglaciation compare with the present days? These are all questions that can be explored with some ice sheet-wide summary dataset reconstruction, but also modeling experiments. And then finally, another important motivation for this work is that we have a rapidly growing library of geological evidence from around the Greenland ice sheet periphery. A lot of people have been working pretty hard over the past decades to produce a lot of data, whether it is geomorphological or geochronological investigations. However, there was a need when we started working on this for someone to come and collate all this data into a database that can speak to a model and that can be gathered and filtered for this specific purpose. And so producing an ice sheet-wide reconstruction can prove useful to ease quantitative model data comparison efforts. So following these motivations, there were two main aims to this postdoc work that I've conducted. The first one has been published, and it's in the paper that we attached to this presentation, and that will be the first 20 minutes of presentation. And after that, I'll talk about the second aim, which has not been published, which is in sort of writing mode right now. The data is there, and so I'll be mostly talking about that for the rest of the talk. And so the first aim was to produce an ice sheet-wide isochrone reconstruction of ice extent for the Greenland ice sheet's late glacial and Holocene evolution, informed by a comprehensive geological dataset of former ice extent markers. And the second aim was to use this geological record, this database that we compiled, to score and calibrate numerical ice sheet model simulations simulating the evolution of the ice sheet between the LGM to the pre-industrial era. So we really focus in time here for the past 25,000 years of the Quaternary. And we only really focus on ice extent when we calibrate our models against data. So this project actually started before I arrived during the pandemic. three people in Sheffield, Chris Clark, Carla Hune, and Sharman Jones, started mapping ice marginal landforms around the periphery of the Greenland ice sheet. The goal was to map around the entire Greenland ice sheet's periphery in a consistent manner. So they started from scratch using the Arctic DEM new release, and they mapped into these 18 boxes that you can see on this plot. So we have these 18 green boxes with a lot of pink ice margins, and these landforms basically gather everything that can represent a former margin of the Greenland ice sheet. So they can be moraines, they can be lateral moraines, they can be lateral meltwater channels, eskers, proglacial fans, things like this. And in total, they mapped over 200,000 landforms around the periphery. You can see an example here of the mapping. So this is in North Greenland. We have the hillshade of the Arctic DEM on the left panel, and on the right, we have the superimposed ice marginal landforms. So in this case, we have very nice preservation of the geomorphology and the moraines, and you can start to see the retreat pattern of the Greenland ice sheets mapped in detail here by these people. So once we had a database of landforms, I came in and I started compiling a database of dates, so geochronological markers of ice extent and the timing of this ice extent, only for the Greenland ice sheet main body. So not for the peripheral glaciers and ice caps, but just for the Greenland ice sheets. And we compiled a database of cosmogenic exposure ages and radiocarbon ages, as you can see here in an Excel database format, but also in a shapefile database format. And this includes all the metadata required for recalculation, for finding the original papers, for finding where the location of that sample is on the map, etc., etc. And so this, along with the landform database, is available open access alongside the PaleoGRIS paper. So if anyone is interested, they can directly access this and download it. Once we had this, there are thousands of ages in there. It took a while. We also needed to simplify this product. So if you were to plot every single age on a map, you would end up with a very messy situation where it would be tricky to do an isochrone ice extent reconstruction at the ice sheet scale. So we needed to simplify this product a bit. And what we came up with is this concept of summary event ages. So what they are is, if you have several boulders dating a moraine, then you would end up with one summary event age for that moraine, which is a summary of all the other ages, for example, using statistics of mean and standard deviation, or depending on the dating techniques, that varies. And so what you see here on these maps is summary event ages for radiocarbon in pink stars and for cosmo ages in yellow dots. And so bear in mind that behind each of these symbols, there could be numerous ages that are hidden and help inform the summary event age. When we calculated, these outliers were removed when they were identified as such by original authors. The data was overall filtered, and there was a quality control assessment that was conducted, such that for each of these dots, we have 3 categories of high, medium, and low confidence ages. And this is following a protocol that was established before us by Brit Ice project, but also the Pat Ice, and also a dated project for the Eurasian ice sheet. So this is a summary of the temporal distribution of these summary event ages. So you can see that most of the ages are between 14 and 6,000 years ago in Greenland. That is because before that, before 14,000 years ago, the ice sheet was predominantly marine terminating, and it's much harder to get evidence and geochronological dates for the extent of the ice sheets when you have to go offshore and collect marine sediment cores. It's a lot more work, it's a lot harder. And so there are much fewer dates of this nature. And then younger than 6,000 years ago, actually, we have the Holocene thermal maximum that peaked at around 5,000 years ago, which is when the green ice sheet was actually in many regions more retreated than the present day. And so we don't have evidence of samples, we don't have organics, we don't have marine boulders, because the ice sheet grew over them to its present position. And so that's where you start seeing more ages towards a neoglacial period, towards 1,000 years ago. Okay, so the blue polygon here is what we focused the PaleoGRIS dataset and reconstruction on. So once we had our dates and landforms that you can see here, for example, in the dots and stars, but also in the purple lines for the landforms, we wanted to combine that information into this isochrone reconstruction. So isochrones are, in this case, these lines of former ice extent that we basically trace to reconstruct the evolution of the Greenland ice sheet margin. And what we do is we attach a temporal uncertainty to these isochrones based on the uncertainty related to the actual summary event ages. So here, for example, you can see in black, we have an uncertainty of 500 years. And then we also have an uncertainty that is spatially expressed by the quality of the geomorphology or the geochronological markers that we have. So for this, we have different levels of confidence that are highlighted by the color code here. So we have high confidence isochrones in green. These, for example, go through both some high and medium confidence dates and also through some landforms. So here we have pretty good confidence as to where the former extent of the ice sheet was. We have some medium confidence isochrones in orange where we go through some dates of medium confidence, but we almost have no landforms. And also another case scenario is we have these red lines here where we have good landforms that indicate the overall retreat pattern of the ice sheets, but we don't really have any dates. So we consider these to be quite low confidence. This was an example from Western Greenland. This is an example from Eastern Greenland, Scoresby Sound area. And you can see we have a fourth category, which are these purple lines. These are very low confidence isochrones. These are only inferred basically when we have only topography and bathymetry, no other information. And it's made to connect the dots and to connect the data between our other confidence levels, isochrones, and to close the loop and make a full periphery ice sheet when we don't have any data. So these should really not be trusted as actual ice margins. Okay, so what the reconstruction looks like is a bit like this. So if we do polygons with these isochrones, we end up with this. So it goes from 14,000 years ago down to 6.5, and this is for the northern half of the ice sheet. You can see that we don't reconstruct the behavior of individual periphery glaciers and ice caps. As soon as we start disconnecting from the ice sheet, we just remove them from our reconstruction, because this would require even more work, even more data compilation, and it was a bit beyond what we could do. Although I don't exclude this from being a product of the next version if we can. And you can see that we don't reconstruct the Inuitian ice sheet, which is more the land of April Dalton, with the Laurentide ice sheet, and we merge with them, but we don't infer any reconstruction from there. Sorry, the Inuitian ice sheet is over Ellesmere Island, for those who don't know, over here. And this and the Greenland ice sheet coalesced together during the last glacial maximum, which is why we have this line here, cutting the product. I'm going to show you the same for the, oh yeah, this is just the same information, but just to say that we have an important event that happened between 9 and 8.5 thousand years ago when we have the opening up of Nares Strait, which is this this body of water that is located between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. And yeah, it's basically the timing that we have for this reconstruction for the opening of Nares Strait. This is for the southern half of the ice sheet, so you can see the evolution of our reconstruction again. Note that an important point is that when we reach the present-day ice sheet, for example, you can see in this nuke area here, we see that the polygon reaches the present-day ice sheet. We stop mapping, essentially, we stop our isochrone. We don't infer any position beyond the present-day ice sheet margin, even though the former ice sheet could have been more retreated during the Holocene, because we don't have any information of where it was. So at this point, our polygons are very much maximum limiting extent estimates rather than absolute estimates. Okay, so once we have this reconstruction, we can do some ice sheet-wide analysis. For example, here I've plotted the area change of the green ice sheet based on this reconstruction with our green and orange dots. And I've plotted a sort of hypothetical interpretation of the pathway of evolution of the ice sheet on top of that in dash. And here I've plotted some climate and ocean indicators. So here you have some sea surface temperature records from different places around Greenland. You have some the Delta 18O record from the ice core, and you have some temperature estimations from the ice core and from some model experiments. And what you can see is we follow a similar pattern. So we have the retreat that really starts to kick in at the end of Heinrich Schedule 1, about 15,000 years ago. We have the retreat that really is quite intense during the Bolling Allerod warming, slightly advanced potentially during the Younger Dryas, and then a steady retreat during the early Holocene. And then we don't really know how far it retreated, as I said, because it was behind the present-day ice sheet margin. And so that's why I've changed the color to these orange dots or triangles here, where these are only max limiting extent estimates and not absolute extent estimates. What's interesting then is to start looking at individual regions. So we have some heterogeneous responses depending on which region we look at. So here you can see we've divided the green ice sheet into 7 major regions, classically divided by drainage basins, basically. So we have the southeast in black, southwest, central west, northwest, northeast, and central east. And what I've done is I've looked at the percentage aerial extent loss for each of these regions through time for our time of reconstruction from the paleoglyphs isochrones. And what you see is some pretty strong differences. So for example, the northwest region in gray here loses a minimum of 20 to 25% of its extent, while in the same amount of time, the southwest region, which is quite close to it here, loses up to at least 40 to 45% of its extent, so up to twice more actually. So we have some heterogeneous responses. The same can be seen in this plot. So here you have, I've basically drawn some transects for 72 outlet glaciers around the periphery of the ice sheet margin, and I've computed their retreat rates based on my isochrone reconstruction. And what you see is if we look at the regional mean retreat rates, here for the central west region, we have a retreat rate of 50 meters per year on average. Just next to it in the northwest region, we have much less. We have half of that, 24 meters per year. So we have some strong differences between regions, even though they all follow a similar climatic pattern. So it's quite interesting. I think in the paper, we discussed that some of these are definitely due to climate and especially different ocean forcings, but also we think that the topography of Greenland and hypsometric variables have an important control on these variability between regions. Another thing that this reconstruction can be really useful for, I think, is to target places for fieldwork. So here I've highlighted places in pink that are terrestrial and that we consider data scarce, basically because we were only able to draw low confidence or very low confidence isochrones because we either didn't have any landforms or not enough dates, basically. And so from that data set, I was able to reconstruct this map of places that we consider as data scarce onshore and offshore. As you can see, there's a lot more space to explore offshore. I mean, that's not surprising. It's much harder to conduct work there, but at least it gives a sort of first order estimate of where it is really useful to go and sample. And it shows that we have a lot of work to do to do more sampling, actually. So for example, this summer I went in this region here, based on this map to do a cosmogenic sampling reconstruction project here. So this work is not just, I guess the PAGLAC grant that I've been working on is not just compiling data, we're also trying to contribute some new data by actually going to the field. So yeah, this is sort of take-home messages, conclusion slide for that first half of the talk. Yes, so we have this ice sheet-wide isochrone reconstruction, which is also an open access database that can be downloaded by anybody of geomorphological and geochronological evidence. You see a summary GIF on the right here for this. It is useful for ice sheet scale analysis, for targeting sites for fieldwork and for keeping track of empirical data. It is also useful for quantitative model data comparisons. So this is what I'll be talking about in the next part of the talk. I would say that it's not that useful for valley and regional scale reconstructions. So local studies will be far more accurate when it comes to actually reconstructing former ice dynamics. And these products should really only be looked at if we are thinking about ice sheet scale analysis, ice sheet scale behavior. And this is the first version of the product, which I hope would be improved in the future as more data comes and as more people work on it. A bit like the dated project is trying to do with Hugh et al. 2016, which was dated 1, and actually Anna has recently told me that dated 2 is very close to being submitted. So it would be nice to update this work from time to time. And so here, if you're interested, you have the paper here, and yeah, I'm going to switch to the next part of the talk. So if you have any questions on that, maybe we'll keep them for the end. So part 2 is about modeling the ice sheet evolution over the last 24,000 years and doing some model data comparisons. So the setup of this experiment is that we use the parallel ice sheet model, PISM, which is it's reasonably fast because it doesn't use high order or full Stokes ice physics, but it's more based on the hybrid model. So it has the shallow ice approximation to the ice column. And then at the base, it uses the shallow shelf approximation, which is why we call this a hybrid model for the stress balance. In this experiment, we tried to have the sort of state-of-the-art space and time-dependent ocean, atmosphere, sea level, and isostatic forcings. You can see the size of the domain on the top right panel here. We take into account the entire Greenland ice sheet, but also the Inuitian ice sheet over Ellesmere Island here. As I said before, these coalesced over Nares Strait, and this coalescence has a lot of impact on the dynamics of the ice from the Greenland ice sheet in the northern region. So if you coalesce these two ice masses, you're going to buffer and eventually slow down the ice velocities from North Greenland. And that has an impact on ice thickness, on flux, and then dynamics overall during the LGM. So it's important to model the two together, really. Here, we use a spatial resolution that is homogeneous through the grid. It doesn't have any refined meshes, and it's a 5-kilometer grid. So when it comes to running an ensemble, this is a sort of unprecedented high resolution for this domain. And we model over the last 24,000 years. And so because you can end up with hundreds of parameters in these models that all have these random values. Some of them are poorly constrained physically. We don't want to necessarily have to make choices, objective choices about which parameter value we go for. And you could end up with all kinds of behavior from the ice sheet model that is unexpected. So we follow this approach of running an ensemble, which means that we run a number of simulations, in this case 100, which was the highest number we could afford with a 5-kilometer grid. And within these 100 simulations, we perturbate 10 key parameters. So when you do ensemble studies, there is a rule of thumb that you should use 10 times more simulations than parameters that you perturbate. And these parameters are summarized in this table. I'm not going to go into the detail of what each parameter does, but what I want to say is that we sample parameters in different components of the ice sheet system. So we have a parameter here that really modifies the stress balance. So the ice viscosity, the ice flow, basically. We have 3 parameters that control the basal conditions and the basal sliding of our model. We have some parameters that control surface mass balance, some that influence the calving, and then 2 temperature and precipitation offsets parameters that actually modify the input climate that we give to the model. So speaking of the climate, for the temperature forcing, we use data from a Earth system model called ICSM, so the Isotope Enabled Community Earth System model from NCAR in Boulder. And they've produced a nice experiment that is transiently running from 19,000 years ago to 11,000 years ago, which is called iTrace. So we use data from that. We also use data from the same model, time slice simulations for data slices that we don't have in iTrace. So 21,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and the pre-industrial era, 1850 AD. And we still have some bridges to gaps. So in between those data points, we use the glacial index method using the Buzut et al. 2018 signal as a curve to bridge the gaps, basically. And what you end up with is continuous data spatially and temporally for example, here we have mean annual temperature at the top here and summer temperature at the bottom here. And so I've just highlighted different time slices. So we have the Heinrich Schedule 1, 17,000 years ago, Bolling Alarod, 14.6 thousand years ago, Holocene thermal maximum, 6,000 years ago, and then the pre-industrial era. You have the same at the bottom for summer temperature. So yeah, here it's interesting to see that we had around Greenland, according to this data, we had mean annual temperatures of around -40 to -50 degrees during Heinrich Schedule 1. Okay, this is for precipitation. So precipitation comes from the same exact protocol, same exact data source, iTrace, ICSM, and the glacial index method. You can see the same snapshots here for Heinrich Schedule 1, Bolling Alarod, Holocene thermal maximum, and the mean precipitation for the pre-industrial era. And then we also have some sea surface temperature reconstruction data from the Osman et al. 2020 paper. So because we have a marine terminating ice sheets even today, but more so during the LGM, we really need to compute subshelf melt, so the interaction between the ocean and the ice underneath floating ice shelves. And so we use salinity data for this from iTrace and ICSM, and then we use sea surface temperature data from this Osman et al. Reconstruction, and that allows us to compute the thermodynamics and get a subshelf melt, basically. The Osmanita reconstruction is still from iTrace and ICSM. However, they use a clever data simulation technique to incorporate reconstruction from proxy data from sea surface temperature records around the world, allowing you to correct for biases in the original model data. Okay, so I've talked about the forcing. Now, what we ended up doing is running 100 simulations from 24,000 years ago to the present day, or the pre-industrial era, sorry. This experiment took about 1.5 years to run on the cluster. It was quite a lot of effort. And here, this is the final results, basically. So we have on the left the areal extent of the ice sheet. It's just the granite ice, and it's just the Greenland ice sheet. I've removed the Inuitian ice sheet from there. And you can see all the different models and all of their different behaviors. And on the right, you have the volume of the ice sheet expressed in sea level contribution. So I'm going to show a lot of these plots, so I'm just explaining them here. The 0 line is the present day volume of the ice sheet, which is actually 7.42 meters of sea level equivalent. But you remove that, and here you end up with a 0, which means that anything above that is more voluminous than the present day ice sheet. And for example, if it's all the way up there, if you were to melt that volume, you would have about 7 meters of sea level rise globally. So that's the way that we sort of present this volume here. I've also added some key components, some key acronyms and names. So HS1 is for Heinrich Schedule 1, which is a really strong cooling, which coincides with the local LGM. The late glacial period is characterized by 2 events, the Bolling-Alderod warming, which is when we had most of the deglaciation happening, and then the Younger Dryas cooling event, which is when we had a slight regrowth of the ice sheets. And then during the Holocene, past 11.7 thousand years ago, is this sort of behavior. And so we have all kinds of behavior from our models. That's good. That's what we wanted. We expected this because we sampled across lots of parameters in lots of different ways. So what do we do now with this ensemble? So the idea is to score each simulation against data to understand which one is doing better at reproducing what we know from the empirical record. So for this, we have 3 tests. They only really concern ice extent. We have test number 1, which is for the local LGM. We use a mask that is located here in pink. So it's constrained between the continental shelf break, which is the maximum extent of where the granite ice can reach, really. And then the outermost paleogris isochrone, which is inside that mask. And so we expect during the local LGM, the ice sheet to grow into that mask, basically. So more of the pixels that are covered, the better the score. Test number 2 is actually using the paleogris reconstruction. So what I presented in the first half of the talk. We have these buffer masks that are between our isochrones because our isochrone lines are actually too high resolution for a model that is only 5 kilometer resolution. And so we use these buffer between isochrones to have 13 masks covering zones between the paleogris isochrones. So we go from 13.5 to 6.5 thousand years ago. And then we have test number 3, which is the present day ice sheet mask. We sample to 5 kilometers and we compare how well our pre-industrial state, so the last frame of our simulation, how does it compare to this mask, basically. And so we do this by using a tool called ATAT, which was developed by Jeremy Ely, a colleague of mine in Sheffield a few years ago. And it allows us to score both the ice extent and the timing of a treat. So for example, in paleogris, each of these buffer has a time and uncertainty associated with it. And we want to know whether a model is retreating at the correct time and at the correct rate. And so for the rest of the talk, I'll talk a lot about these 5 best LGM simulations, which are the 5 best 95th percentile score at this test. The 5 best deglacial simulations, the ones that are the best at this second test, and then the 5 best PI simulations at this 3rd test. We also have the 5 best overall simulations that have been through this sieving process. So if we look at the best simulations at test 1, only keep those, then do another sieve at test 2, only keep those, and then a last sieve at test 3, we end up with 5 simulations that are the overall best. So this is just to let you know what I'm talking about in the rest of the talk, basically. Okay, so some results from that. if we look just at the LGM here, I've plotted the aerial extent. You have the full ensemble in gray lines, and then you have some highlighted simulations for the ones that score best at the LGM test. So test number 1, highlighted on top. And what I've done is also plot the paleogrid data in these triangles here. So you can see that we are we are completely underestimating the retreat during the early Holocene, but I'll talk about this later in the talk. But here, if we focus on LGM, we see that the maximum LGM extent is between 17.5 and 16,000 years ago. And this is mostly controlled by the input climate forcing, basically. So it's not a surprise to us. Yeah, and you can see here I've highlighted different types of paleogrid reconstructions. I have the black triangles, and then I have the pink ones. And the pink ones is really to say that these are reconstructed from very limited amount of data, so they should be really taken with a pinch of salt. They are much lower confidence, and so they could be further left, they could be further right. It's not necessarily to say that our model is completely wrong here, completely too early, although it might be too early. But the retreat rate, you can see the slope here, is quite good compared to paleogrids. So that's already quite reassuring. I've also shown the present day ice sheet extent in the dashed line here, which corresponds to basically the youngest paleogrid isochrone. Another thing that we learned from this model is that during the full glaciation, granite ice likely reached the continental shelf break along the western, southern, and southeastern Greenland coasts. This is not new stuff. It's not a big surprise, but it's good to see the model produces it quite easily, actually. So you see here we have the 5 best LGM simulations. We have the grounding lines of those simulations. So where the granite ice reaches for each of them at the LGM. And you'll see that we're covering most of this gray mask. This gray mask is the mask that I was showing during test 1, which is supposed to highlight the mask of scoring for the LGM extent, which is supposed to be where we think the ice sheet grew, basically. However, you can see that in the northeast and the central east, we are not growing at all on top of this mask. And so we really are underestimating the extent of the ice sheet during the LGM in this region. In other regions, though, it's doing a pretty good job. And those 5 best simulations really reach the right extent. What we also learn about the volume is quite interesting. So if we only look at granite ice above flotation, taking a time-dependent sea level, so we take into account the fluctuations of the sea level through time, we see that at the local LGM, the global mean sea level rise contribution of the ice sheet, so the excess volume compared to today, was possibly between 6 and 8 meters. So you can see these highlighted lines here are the 5 best simulations, and they're above 6 meters of sea level equivalent. This is quite a bit more than was previously estimated in the literature. So everyone calculates this number slightly differently, but the trend over the past few years has been to go for closer to 4 to 5 meters. So we're a bit higher than that, which is interesting. Another thing that we learned from this experiment is that the ice sheet was flowing faster. I mean, it's not a huge surprise, but it's nice to see it, than the present day. So here you have the 5 best simulations, ice surface velocities from the model, plotted here for the 5 best simulations at the LGM. You have the black line as well for the continental shelf break, and the blue line is a sort of minimum limiting extent scenario for the LGM based on debates in the literature. And I've also plotted the present day ice sheet observations of velocity with the same color map. So you can compare the amount of red, basically. When you start having some bright red, the ice sheet is flowing faster than 1,000 meters per year. So we really start to have some ice streaming. And here you can see that the ice streams are very large, very wide, very long compared to the present day. We have much faster ice flow. We have much more discharge. If we look at discharge only, we have up to 5 times more discharge than today. So what I show here is the full ensembles time series with some highlighted colors for the 5 best LGM simulations on the top panel and the 5 best simulations at the deglacial tests in the bottom panel. So we have just 2 tests basically. And you can see that during Heinrich Schedule 1, so really the local LGM here at 16.5 thousand years ago, we have a discharge rate that is above 1,000 gigatons per year and up to nearly 2,000 gigatons per year, 2,300 gigatons per year. And the present day discharge rate estimate for the Greenland ice sheet is highlighted here in this black dashed line, and its uncertainty with the pink polygon around it. And it's around 480 gigatons per year. So you see that we have much more discharge back then. And that has implications for the amount of fresh water you're able to put into the North Atlantic and it has implications for the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and therefore the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. So I think it's quite important to know how much discharge, to quantify it, was there during the LGM, during the deglaciation, and how does it compare to today? Also, interestingly, we see that in most of these simulations in the full ensemble, during the Holocene, we don't have discharge rates that are nearly close to what we have at the present day. We have some simulations, but most of them are lower discharge rates than the present day. So that tells us something about the anthropogenic forcing in the context of the Holocene, which is interesting as well. If we look at the deglaciation here, so this is the period of really rapid and extensive retreat of the Greenland ice sheet between 16 and 14,000 years ago, during the late Heinrich Stadial 1 and early Bolling-Allerod. We have this massive retreat from all of our ensemble simulations, basically. And what's interesting to see is that most of this retreat is predominantly caused by ocean warming and increased subshelf melt, while air temperatures are possibly too cold to generate any significant surface melt on top of the ice sheet. So I tried to show this in these plots. So on the top panels, we have modeled ice sheet mass change due to basal mass flux. So this is basically all caused by subshelf melt, because at the time we are marine terminating ice sheets around the majority of the periphery of the ice sheet. And I've shown it for the 5 best simulations at the LGM test and also at the deglacial test, so test number 1 and test number 2. And at the bottom, I show from our surface mass balance model the amount of surface melt rates that is computed for all the ensembles with the best simulations highlighted again. And what you see is before the start of the Holocene, before the end of the Younger Dryas, we are too cold in terms of atmospheric temperatures, despite varying those climates hugely between our ensemble simulations by the sampling of the parameters. We are still too cold in all simulations to create significant surface melts. However, if we look at the basal mass flux, we see really strong mass change loss during the Bolling-Allerod warming, so 14.5 thousand years ago. And so this shows that basically this extensive retreat of the ice sheet is mostly marine terminating, marine caused, marine forced, basically, due to increased subshelf melt. During this retreat phase, the ice sheet was losing mass potentially 2 to 5.6 times faster than today, according to this modeling. So again, here I've plotted the present day estimates of mass loss rates, which is between 200 to 300 gigatons per year. That's an average over the period of 2003 to 2020 in this paper by Simonsen et al. And what I've done is also plot the model annual change in Gris volume, so just the rate of mass change. And you can see that during this peak deglaciation phase, Bolling-Allerod, early Bolling-Allerod, we have mass loss rates of between 500 to up to 1,500 gigatons per year, depending on which simulation we look at. And so we have quite a lot more than the present day. And again, interestingly, during the Holocene, none of the ensemble simulations suggests the rate of mass loss that we are experimenting today. So likely unprecedented for the past 10,000 years. Although I have to say that our simulations are not necessarily the best at representing the Holocene ice extent, so I would also be cautious there. Okay, so speaking of model data misfits, earlier in the talk, I talked briefly about this misfit between our ensemble and the paleogris data. But what's actually interesting is to look at it regionally. So if we divide the ice sheet into these 7 regions again, the same 7 regions as before, we see that we have much better model agreement between the paleogris reconstruction and our model in certain regions and much worse in other regions. So here, I just want you to focus on the triangles here, those dots that you can see in the plots, and where do they lie in relationship with the ensemble. So this is ice area, ice extent for granite ice modeled by our simulations. You have all the ensembles, and then highlighted on top, you have the 5 best simulations overall. So these are the ones that survive all the sieves across all 3 tests. So there should be the simulations that behave the best at every single test, hopefully. And you can see that in the Southeast, I mean, you know, our ensemble is not perfectly matching, but it's pretty good. Similarly in the Southwest, in the Central West as well, we follow some good trajectories. And also in the Northwest, we follow some good trajectories and we have similar magnitude of retreats. However, if you start looking at the northern region, the retreat is completely underestimating what we reconstruct from paleoglyphs, but also the advance, actually. Our full ensemble is not dynamic enough. Same story in the northeast, so that green region here. You see that we are completely underestimating the advance and the retreat. And in the Central East, we are not underestimating the advance. I mean, the continental shelf break is not too far away, so it's not too hard to get the right advance. However, the retreat is still completely underestimated. So that's mostly the Scoresby Sound region where we have this big fjord network that in our model is not being deglaciated, basically, nearly enough. So we have some heterogeneous model data misfits, which are interesting. And it shows that modeling the northern, northeastern, and central eastern regions is more challenging, at least according to our experiment. But I've also talked to a lot of modelers trying to play with the past green ice sheet models, and they all experience the same when it comes to modeling the green ice sheet. So if you focus on the southwest, central west, and northwest regions, but also the southeast, then it should be, with the tools that we have today, it should be fairly straightforward. However, the other regions are much more problematic. There are many, many possible reasons for this. I've just listed the ones that I believe are the most potent here. So the first one could be model resolution. So this part of Greenland, northeast, central east, is dominated by a higher concentration of high topographies and deep fjords, narrow fjords. And I think that a 5 kilometer resolution, even though that's quite high compared to previous studies, is still way too coarse for resolving those fjords properly, for resolving the proper topography, and as a result, for getting the retreat dynamics because of the surface slope, because of the water ingress that is coming into these deep fjords. We could also have a problem with the input climate. So this input climate comes from Earth system models that in themselves need an ice sheet reconstruction. Here, in this case, it's ice 6G. And we know for a fact that ice 6G is too thick and too extensive for too long in the north and northeast of Greenland. So it could be giving us a wrong climate because of that. And there could be potentially smarter ways around this, which I didn't implement because I didn't really know when I started this experiment that this would be a problem. Also some downscaling problems. So you take Earth system model data that is really coarse because it's meant to model the entire globe, and we downscale it to 5 kilometers. And the way you do this, regardless of how fancy your algorithm is, could be quite problematic for certain variables like precipitation or temperature. We also have some simplified ice flow physics. We use the hybrid model here because it's cheap enough to do this experiment. But if you have higher order or full Stokes physics, then you probably will capture the dynamics of the ice, especially in the high topography terrain and the steep surface slope terrain, much more effectively and much more accurately than if you have the shallow ice approximation like we do. And then another important thing, I think, is the east and north of the ice sheets is dominated by periphery ice caps and glaciers that are still here today. And I think that our ice sheet model could be not too far off in ice thickness. However, it doesn't disconnect from these periphery ice caps and glaciers. And so it completely overestimates the ice thickness, the ice extent, sorry. Although the ice thickness might not be too far off, because all you need is just a little bit of disconnection from these periphery ice caps, which we don't capture here. That could be another reason for this mismatch. Here, I don't have much time, so I'm going to skip this, but I just wanted to show you one of the best simulation ice velocity fields through time and how it matches the paleoglyphs data, which is this black line here. So you can see, for example, there is one panel here at 11.7 thousand years ago where the granite ice extent from a model matches quite well. The paleoglyphs reconstruction in black. However, beyond that, as we go into the deglaciation and to the Holocene, we should be more retreated than that, and we basically don't deglaciate these regions. Okay, I'm going to skip through that. So for the last few minutes, I just wanted to talk about the future a bit. So far I've talked mostly about the past, but an important thing and motivation about this study was also to quantify potentially the impact of reconstructing and calibrating the past Greenland ice sheet evolution for future projections. So for this, I've run a little simple experiment. I took one of my best simulations. So here we have the 5 best simulations highlighted again, and I take number 26, which is this light blue one. And the reason for this is because it reaches a very good or a pretty good volume at the present day that is close to the present day green ice sheet volume. And what I do with this is I run 2 future simulations from the pre-industrial era to the end of the 21st century. The only difference between these 2 simulations is the initial state. So the first one in blue, initial state, has the paleohistory, which means that we just take simulation 26, its transient evolution through the past 24,000 years, and we then model the future. In the second case, the orange one, we keep the same parameters as number 26, the same model, but instead of taking the paleohistory, we remove the paleohistory and we do what's called a steady state spin-up. So that's quite commonly the case that people do this for future projections. They spin up the ice sheet to the present day under steady state climate, and then they run into the future. So this is what we do here. We really prescribe a pre-industrial climate that is steady, and we run the ice sheet until it reaches an equilibrium with the climate, a steady state, and then we run into the future. So that's the only difference is the initial state. The model parameters are the same, the model itself is the same, and the climate forcing is the same, okay? And we also make sure that the geometry of these two initial states is identical. So we force the geometry to be the same. And for the climate and ocean forcing, we use orbital data for the pre-industrial era to 2000, and then we use CMIP6 forcing for the period 2000 to the end of the century. And we use the worst case emission scenario SSP 8.5. Okay, so these are the results from this little experiment. You see here absolute granulized area change, so the change in areal extent of the ice sheet from 1850 to the end of the century. And you see the difference between the no paleohistory scenario, which is the steady state spin-up, and the paleohistory scenario. So we have much more retreat of the ice sheet with that. So you see a clear difference. And then here we have the volume. So this is the sea level rise contribution in centimeters of water equivalent by the end of the century. And still you see we have much more mass loss when we take into account the paleohistory. So the difference in area here, just for numbers, is about 60,000 kilometers squared. That is the size of Ireland in terms of country size. So that's quite a big of a difference. And in here we have 5 centimeters of water equivalent difference in sea level rise by the end of the 21st century. So the difference is a factor of 2 between those two things. So what could be causing this difference? I believe that it's basically based on the basal ice thermal regime. So when you include the paleohistory, you have all of the thermal history that is incorporating into the ice body. That has an impact on the basal ice temperature of the ice sheet. So here we have the initial state for the paleohistory scenario on the left and the no paleohistory scenario on the right. So at the pre-industrial era, and you see that we have much more temperate ice on the left, and here we have slightly less temperate ice on the right. And this has quite a bit of an impact on what we call the basal stress. So that's the resistance to sliding. So here, whenever you have blue colors, you have more resistant bed, harder bedded conditions. And when you're towards the brown colors, you have softer bed, more sliding for a given driving stress for the ice sheet. And what you see is we have much more blue on the right-hand sides here. So we're much less likely to have fast ice flux, fast thinning rates, and as a result, margin retreat when you start warming the ice sheet up with climate change. So this is what is explaining this difference, basically. Okay, so take-home messages. I hope I haven't been too long from this modeling second part of the talk. We have a new ensemble of ice sheet-wide simulations from 24,000 years ago to the pre-industrial era at an unprecedented spatial resolution of 5 kilometers, at least for this type of simulations. There are numerous insights that we can gain from this experiment. I've only listed a few here in the matter of time, but the list goes on. Especially when it comes to the LGM and the last deglaciation, because during the Holocene, we have large model data misfits that prevent us from making too big conclusions. Speaking of those, we still have large model data misfits that remain. And of course, that means that we have a lot of work to do, which is good news. And yeah, I think there's lots of improvements here to be done to this type of experiments. And last but not least, one of the messages here to take home is that the late Quaternary history of the green ice sheet impacts its future evolution significantly and is thus important to use in future projections. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you all, and I also thanks my colleagues who worked with me on this project. And yeah, I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Do we have any questions online?
Hello, Bergen here. I think we might have a question. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Charlotte. Thank you very much for sharing all these insights on your research with us today. And I wanted to ask something about the first part of your presentation, so the Paleo GIS version 1. And there's like all those areas that you've identified as important to collect more empirical evidence. Are there any specific areas that you would propose to focus on first? And are there maybe some additional methods that you would propose for such studies?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. I guess I am more experienced with the terrestrial reconstruction side because that's what I did during my PhD. So if I was to choose places, I would probably focus more on the pink areas. I would say the places where there is good potential for more studies, but also it's hard, is the northern part of the ice sheet where we don't really know how quickly the ice sheet retreated because it's very hard to get data from there. It's very far away, and also dating for cosmogenic nuclides, for example, has been challenged over there by inheritance problems, which is related to cold-based ice, we think. But so now we have fancier techniques with in situ carbon-14, which seems to produce good results from this region of Greenland. And so if I was to really, if I had money to go back into the field, I would probably focus on going back up there and really dating with in situ carbon-14 rather than beryllium-10, or at least combine the two to get some data. So I know a bunch of teams around the world that are actually doing this right now. So this is work that is being conducted. And it will be great to get more data from up there. And then when it comes to marine terminating, this requires, essentially what it requires is teams getting together on big funding, going for cruises and collecting lots of cores deep enough to get to the till and finding some organic materials. And there's a bunch of initiatives to do this right now, and this is great. So there is the Kangar project that was just on the field this summer to this region here, if you can see my pointer. And yeah, I would say that any of these blue areas would be would be great to get some more data and some more mapping from. Yeah.
Thank you.
But this is less I've never done that type of work, so I wouldn't be really an expert on the technique to use specifically. But yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, then maybe I'll have another one. So you're stressing in the paper that was attached to the program to this talk today, you're really stressing on this Paleo GIS to be something that needs to be continuously revised by the scientific community. Is like, what kind of communication strategy do you have for distributing the reconstruction and involving more people in working on it?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. It's something that I've been talking to Anna Hugh about 2 weeks ago at a workshop in the UK, actually, quite a bit. And I think I would quite like to follow her example with this, which is basically we need to organize some workshops where we get together as a community. A bit like Jason organized, Jason and Andreas a few years ago for Greenland, which was a fantastic workshop. And that allows the community to get together to make decisions and to collect more data, to talk about new projects. And eventually that would help a lot with updating if we want as a community. I mean, maybe people want to go in different directions because we've made a certain amount of choices for this reconstruction. Maybe some people want to do other choices. But if there is a need to, or a request to continue updating this, I think it would be nice to do it as a community. And in my opinion, the only way to do this effectively is to gather in workshops rather than trying to communicate online, which is quite challenging. And so Anna Hugh's been doing this with Dated too. She's organized a couple of workshops for the Eurasian ice sheet reconstruction, and that has really helped her as a community build the new version of Dated. And so that would be nice. Another way that I've suggested to do that is when people publish new data from Greenland, I think it would be absolutely fantastic if they could update the isochrones from paleogris and then provide them in the supplements of their paper. That would really help with people down the line, me, be it, or someone else, compiling everything together and making a new version of PaleoGris. So I think it's easy enough if you have GIS skills to just update based on your new data, the isochrones, and just put them as supplements to your paper. So yeah, that's one way to contribute. That would be super useful for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good luck with continuing that work.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your questions.
Any further questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Jason also has a question. All right. Hi, great talk. My name's Danielle. And I had a quick question on part 2 for your modeling with the last glacial maximum extent, especially in Northeast Greenland. So I had the question that none of the edges extend up to your mask all the way. And that's probably because of there's this underestimate, like this lack of data that you have on the marine isochrones. But do you think that especially in this area, that there needs to be a higher resolution for your simulations, or do you think it's more important to get more of that isochrone print, like the data set, to help with trying to understand more of the dynamics in that area?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, there are two things. There is getting the advance correctly to over that gray mask that you can see here, which is something that we don't model in this particular experiment. I mean, I know that some people have more success with that. And then there is also capturing the retreat right. And these are two distinct problems which could potentially be related to two, well, they could be solved in two ways. I think that for the advance, one of the key problems in our model is the calving, and this is a problem with all ice sheet models because the calving laws are some of the less well-constrained laws that we have in ice sheet modeling. And I believe that the laws that we have in PISM are quite simple, and they probably produce ice shelves that are way too big, way too erratic. Actually, we have to physically constrain them, otherwise they grow too big. And this could have an impact on ice flux because as soon as you start building big ice shelves, you have very fast flowing ice. And that fast flowing ice actually thins your ice sheet model upstream. And as a result, you might not be able to extend the granite ice enough. So this is one of the reasons I think is potentially happening. I know that Stuart Jamieson in Durham has had a bit more luck just modeling this area by constraining the extent of ice shelves more, and therefore being able to grow the ice sheet model further into the continental shelf. So this could be a reason. I don't think resolution is that important because then at this point, we need to build an ice sheet that is so thick that is completely unconstrained by topography, I believe. Although I might be wrong here because maybe Neges and some of these fast ice streams in the Northeast might still be really important, even at the LGM. So maybe resolution helped. I think maybe a bit less than during the deglaciation. However, during the deglaciation, this area is really full of narrow fjords and high topography. And I think that higher auto models, higher resolution is going to be important to capture that retreat accurately in this region, which we don't have here because 5 kilometers is a bit too close, I think, for this, which is where models that have an adaptive mesh with higher resolution on the edges can be a really good approach here. However, I'm only aware of, I mean, the few models that exist that do this are still too costly to run these big ensemble simulations. So we still have this computational bottleneck here that we're facing. But yeah, I hope that answers a little bit your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more from Jason's group.
Yeah, hi there. Dialing in from Buffalo with a group of folks here who really enjoyed your talk. So thanks a lot for that. Of course, the advantage of this great work you've done is the ability to have an ensemble. And so my question is, among the individual model simulations that passed your various sieve tests, do they point towards, when you look at your 10 variables, do they all have something in common that help you constrain knowledge on some of those knobs that you turned?
That's a great question. So I have this figure for this, which is here. I don't know if you can see it. So here you see the 10 parameters in each of these boxes that we vary within the ensemble. And for each of them, I have 3 plots or 3 boxes, sub boxes, which are for each test. So we have the LGM test, the deglacial test, and then the pre-industrial test. And what I've done is you have the 100 points from the 100 samples in gray, and then you have the highlighted points for the 5 best simulations at each test. So the highlighted points are the ones that do the best at each test. And what we see is really a lack of cluster along the Y range. So the Y range is basically the range in between which we sample our parameter values. So the blue lines are the min and max values. And only in the cases where I've highlighted some ellipses in a black dashed line, you see some clustering of those parameters, meaning that actually if you are within that ellipse, you're going to get a good score. Likely you're going to get a good score. But you can see that this only concerns 3 parameters. So with that ensemble, I don't think we have enough simulations. 100 simulations is probably not enough to identify some clustering at each parameter, and that matters. Probably you would need to do thousands of simulations for this to start happening, because you need to explore the parameter space so much that you get to some local minima that are greater than other local minimas. And here in this case, I don't think we explore this well enough with only 100 simulations. But yeah, we still have some parameters like the flow law enhancement factor, the air temperature offsets, and the precipitation offsets that, you can highlight some areas of the parameter range that will score better for the ensemble. And interestingly, actually, for some of these parameters, this value for the parameter is time dependent. So you see that for the LGM and deglacial extent test to score well, we need some high offsets values. And then for the pre-industrial test to score well, we need some much lower than the prescribed climate values. So that's interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that the input climate is wrong. It could be related to interaction with another parameter. However, it shows that if you want to get even better scores and more realistic models, you might want to consider having time-dependent parameter explorations. So spatially and time varying parameter within your ensemble, which will make the ensemble even more complex, but it potentially will produce better results. So, but yeah, it's something that I'm really interested in, and yeah, I really want to explore this a bit further.
All right, we're a little after the hour. I want to thank you so much, Tom. That was really obviously interesting. And next week, I want to plug on October 2nd, we've got Redmond Stein from Columbia University speaking about paleoclimate reconstructions during early human migration to northern Greenland. So hope you'll all join us.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.